Hey there hunters, and welcome back to more Remnant 2 build videos. Still waiting for some bug fixes and a lot of builds actually, but I do have a few more here that have proven to be extremely fun and effective without knowingly relying on exploits, bugs, or more thing setups. So, as mentioned before, we're going to be building differently from now on to accommodate for boss rush on Apocalypse, so no more max DPS glass cannon setup, as we want to be able to safely deal with adds and aberrations, which can kind of throw a wrench in a lot of our gameplay. And so another theme I wanted to look at today was shock and overload. I've tried very hard in the past to make an overload build be good, and it's just not a good status, especially now that it can't crit, but I am determined. So I ended up with two shock theme builds that don't involve Havoc Form. Go figure. With that out of the way, let's get into the first build. As per the usual, we do have two builds to showcase today, but unlike the artisanal chef build, we have actually two very good builds, not one good and one kind of whatever build. That being said, one is still melee, and that's actually the good build, so we're going to lead with that one, as you can see. And this is the Electrocutioner build, utilizing the new Harvester Scythe paired with the Shocker Mutator. As a melee build, the Electrocutioner clears areas insanely well thanks to its AoE that's granted by the Shocker Mutator, and straight ups delete bosses that it can actually hit. While flying bosses are an issue, of course, you can still swap to a Krell Axe or Hunter Spear to get the job done. That being said, the second build we're going to discuss later is going to be more of a thematic swap to a ranged version that can handle flying bosses if you like. Anyway, let's break down the Electrocutioner melee setup first and explain kind of what I'm doing and why we're going with what we're doing. So we're going to be using the Alchemist and Challenger archetypes because it's a melee build and you really can't beat this pair. Alchemist provides us with extra concoctions which are great for damage reduction and stamina regen, as well as Frenzy Dust giving us more melee haste. Challenger provides us a lot of damage through its perks and the Juggernaut skill, as well as stagger resistance, which is kind of hard to come by these days. It's a match made in heaven, to be honest, it really is. The Electrocutioner melee build was so good that I had started to think that the boss rush bosses on Apocalypse were wrongly scaled, because like everything is wonkily scaled in boss rush, and it's true, they are. But I wanted to verify on normal bosses outside of boss rush just to see how the build stood up, and sure enough, yeah, it still slaps cheeks. So now we're going to talk about the weapons, so you can kind of see what we're going for. Obviously, since this is a melee build, we're going to want a melee weapon. And I took a fancy to the new Harvester Scythe, because this weapon gains melee speed as you hit it with a charge swing, which also throws out a phantom copy that hits for 35% of the damage the normal swing does. So it's a pretty big boost in damage, to be honest, and because it has the Scythe moveset, the charge attack will spin and hit 3 times, and that lets us charge the Shocker Mutator on just one charge swing. And the extra cool thing here is that the copy of the Scythe also gets sent out and counts as melee charged hits. So that's actually going to proc hits for Shocker and allow us to activate Shocker on pretty much every charge swing, assuming you're hitting something. And I really like this combination. And of course, more melee speed means more Shocker procs, so melee speed's kind of what we're going to be building for. And it just so happens that the Scythe's mod boosts melee speed. So for the other weapons, we don't particularly care about them because we're a melee build, so the standard Nebula Monolith will suffice just to give us some extra damage with the Exposed and Corroded, and you can just fire and forget them and swap back to melee. Mutators are standard Spellweaver and Feedback for both these weapons, can't really go wrong. I mean, come on, Monolith check, Nebula check, it's a functional build. Moving on to the rings and amulets. Butcher's Fetish is kind of the go-to melee neck, 15% crit chance and 25% crit damage is super fat, and it even works on Shocker Mutator, so can't really go wrong there. Brawler's Pride is for more attack speed since we can't get enough of that, as is Berserker's Crest, but also the stamina reduction it grants is nice since we're not going to be using any infinite stamina setups. Burden of the Gambler is for more crit and crit damage, especially because Shocker can crit. And the last ring here is Siphon Filter for more all damage while we have haste, which again, sorry, but we're going to get back to it in just a second, but just keep note of that. You can also use Token of Favor for 5% all damage and 10% crit since we're running Monolith, but that's only really going to be working while we have Sandstorm up, which we're kind of saving from bosses, so just keep that in mind. For our Prism, we're running the Hyperactive Legendary Fragment for double haste effectiveness, which I know, weird, right? Which when paired with the new trait Perception, brings us up to a 20% haste. I decided to go with this route because there's not really any legendary prisms for melee builds. Sure, Jack of all trades is going to work, but I feel 13% more haste is pretty solid as it provides us with attack speed, movement speed, dodge speed, fire rate, and reload speed. So between this, Frenzy Dust, the Scythe buffs, and the melee speed fragments, and our melee speed rings, yeah, we're going to be swinging pretty fast as you can undoubtedly see. So that's kind of the reason why we're going with Siphon Filter too. That's a 20% all damage bump from that ring, which is going to help our melee, our Shocker Mutator, our Sandstorm, our Nebula, you name it. It's just good. 20% all damage is solid. Sure, crit's fine too, but I wanted to make use of some of the new items, so I'm going to go with Siphon Filter. Anyway, back to the Prism. For the fragments, we're going to be running melee speed, melee crit chance, and critical damage here on top. The fusions are going to be Warrior, Rogue, Longevity, and Hulk, with crit damage as the lone fragment at the end. With this setup, we're going to have 62% crit chance on our melee attacks, or 72% if you go with the token of favor route. Now for our traits, we're going to go with Gifted and Chakra for more upkeep time on Monolith, Nebula, Frenzy Dust, and Juggernaut. That way we can swing our Scythe more. Expertise is pretty much just for boss rush, so we can keep up our skills active and make sure that they're on cooldown by the time we get to the next boss. Bark Skin, Endurance, Vigor, and Fortify, all our basic tankiness things and stats that we need to keep us alive, so yeah, pretty standard. And of course, Perception for the haste bonus, since we're going to be using a lot of haste, and it brings us from a 7% haste to a 10% haste, which then gets doubled to the 20% through the hyperactive fragment. And then lastly, we have some Siphoner just for some leech. Pretty standard outside the Perception trait for a melee build, at least I think so. Now we're also going to be using a lot of consumables with this build. My melee builds are kind of like junkies. We're going to be using the Light Extract for our haste a minute at a time, which is plenty of time for bosses, trust me, and it's not mandatory for room clear. Gold Serum for stamina cost reduction to help maintain our stamina, because again we don't have infinite stamina, and we have Jet Fuel for more attack speed. Concoctions are fairly important as well. Meat Shake and Bark Extract for more damage reduction. Cider is for HP and stamina, and Verdant Tea for stamina regen and cost reductions. Of course, you can also snake oil in a random concoction as well. The gameplay here obviously is fairly simple, as you can see, because it's a melee build. You just need to make sure that you're maintaining your consumables and make sure to dodge. Even though this build can face tank bosses on Apocalypse with Juggernaut active, you can still die to aberrations and elites if you get carried away while your skills are off cooldown, so do be careful. That being said, Monolith and Nebula can carry ads and trash clear very well. Also, aerial bosses, like I said, can be a huge pain. Not that they're impossible. You can swap to Crystal Staff or Parallax for the most part, but even on Annihilation Shahala, it's doable with the Scythe. So for the most part here, you can also just swap to another build to do the more annoying ranged bosses, which is kind of why I came up with the second build that I wanted to showcase here, is just so you can go that route without having to, torture yourself by trying to kill a ranged boss with just a Parallax. Like, doing Bloat King with Parallax kind of sucks. So with that out of the way, let's shift over to the second build here, which is the Electromancer. We're going to have Electrocutioner and Electromancer. It's dorky, I know, but I like themes. Anyway, obviously from what I said before, this is going to be a Shock and Overload build as well, but I didn't want to use Havoc Form because, Havoc Form's been done 100 different ways, and I wanted to do something different, at least, at the start. As you can see here from the gameplay, the Electromancer works. I'm not going to claim it's the best DPS build around, of course. It's not really what I'm building for anymore. It just gets the job done. It's a shock build that can take a hit, it can leech, it can pop ads and clear very well. It deals with Apocalypse bosses at a leisurely pace. Damage is okay on overloads, typically popping for 3 to 5k, which looks cool until you realize that they trigger every 5 seconds. And again, doesn't rely on any exploits or bugs or whatever, so it's patch proof. So yeah, DPS isn't the greatest, but it is the greatest overload build that I can come up with, so let's break it down and see why I picked what I picked. Starting again with the archetype, Ritualist Prime because I wanted Vial to spread our overloads for the clear, and Vial is a 15% multiplicative modifier for dot still, so it's a nice boost of damage. Invoker is pretty much just there for way of Kayula, but as you can tell, we're running Primetime Legendary Fragment to get both our Prime archetypes, so we're getting the second skill used to keep both of our Kayulas and Death Witches maintained, because they will cool down while they're active as well, which is great. Death Wish is just the best skill for Ritualist, 50% damage is nuts, and we're not getting anything better for our overloads, plus it works with everything else you do as well, including Kayula. You could run Warden if you wanted to use shields, but Overload needs all the damage it can get, so more damage it is. Plus, Kayula is shock, and we're scaling a lot of shocks. Regarding the weapons, I'm using a Pulse Rifle with Overflow and Charged Wounds. Why Pulse Rifle? Because I like it. It can quickly tap enemies from long range, apply an overload, pop them, and spread to other enemies. And the initial overload is going to hit for almost 2k just with a brief tap. So, weak spot or a critical hit, and it's pretty much going to one-tap most enemies. And it works out. I've always wanted to use Pulse Rifle on a build because I love the way it feels. I also brought back Enigma specifically because I wanted another weapon that can apply another stack of overload, and Enigma is literally the only choice. I don't like this gun, I wish it didn't need to use it, but it's literally the only other option we have. I don't think it does anything good anymore. We have plenty of good ad clear things with like Vial, Ritualist, Nebula, Monolith, Shocker, World's Edge, you name it. There's a lot of way to clear trash, and Enigma just doesn't cut it anymore. Chaos Driver is absolute meh, and I only use it because once I set up the overloads, on bosses they're going to last a minute, so I have time to burn. For a melee weapon, anything with Shocker works. We're going to want to use Shocker for another stack of overload. And also, that overload ticks independently of your original stack, so you actually get 2 stacks back to back, which feels really good. Obviously, Krell is the best option here, but you can use stuff like Crystal Staff, World's Edge, Hunting Spear for Corroded, whatever. For the most part though, everything that I can use has overload. I use that because I want to stack big overloads. Simple as that, that's the build. For the armor, we're back on medium weight. Do your fashion thing, whatever you want, go for you. For the trinkets, we're running Shock Device for the neck as it does 50% overload damage as well as 25% shock damage, which does help us with Way of Kayula, Enigma, and Shocker. Energized Neck Coil doesn't do much for us here, unfortunately. I don't know what's wrong with it, but it doesn't seem to take into consideration the entire overload dot, so it's only ticking for like 400 to 600, which is pretty bleh. For the rings, we have Burden of the Destroyer, Shadow of Misery, Grounding Stone, and Red Ring of Death, all things that just scale our dot damage. Red Ring of Death is actually pretty good here because it allows us to get 2 charges of overload on the Charged Wounds mutator, and it actually works now, so both the stacks do damage. This is how we get our big overloads from just our little taps of the pulse rifle, as they're going to be blowing up for 2 overloads, which is, 13 to 1800 damage. Now for the Prism. Of course, Prime Time is a legendary, as we said. You can also get Sadistic or Jack of all trades, but Prime Time feels the best for me because it does allow us to get that 15% multiplicative damage and file spreads for Ritualist, or the extra skill uses from Invoker, which obviously just help maintain our DPS on bosses. And then you're going to have to compare that with like the Sadistic Fragment, which is an average of a 25% multiplicative damage modifier. I'd rather just get the spreads or the extra skills, to be honest. Jack of all trades is also fine, but spreads, man, extra Way of Kayula, I don't really want to rely on Enigma. The fusion fragments are going to be Flash, Mage, Revitalize, and Longevity. There's not much here that really help our dots at all because mod damage doesn't increase dot damage, and we don't really do any damage with our skills besides Way of Kayula, so we don't really want to focus on that. For the actual little fragments though, on our Prism, we're going to have our 2 status damages at the end at the start, and skill crit for Way of Kayula, and skill duration for Way of Kayula as well. Really like Way of Kayula, even after the line of sight nerfs. Traits, pretty much what you'd expect, nothing too crazy here. Flash Caster and Amplitude are just for Way of Kayula, and also File Spreads. Kinship is strictly here for Death Wish, we still need that sadly. Spirit and Expertise because we're going to be using mods a lot, Bark Skin, Fortify, Vigor are just my standard traits to not take a hit and die immediately. No Swiftness here, unfortunately, so we're going to be walking pretty slow. And yeah, that's pretty much the Electromancer build. I really wish we had better shock things to use because the only overload mods in the game are Overflow, which is fine, and Voltaic Rondor, which is laughably bad. Obviously, Overload is a bit of a meme right now. It's absolutely the worst status to inflict on enemies, which is funny because it's the worst one to have on yourself. I wish it could still crit, or we had more things to interact with Overload, like hitting it again to consume it, cause it to explode like it did back in Run 1, but I'll save stuff like that for Beyond Hell. Anyway, that's going to be all for me. Thank you all for watching. Builds are in the link below, and stay tuned for more builds in the future. I have tons of ideas, and even at 2 at a time, they're still going to be flying out constantly. So yeah, peace, good luck out there, see y'all next time, goodbye.